Hey,
Do that for me today.
sure. There's church. Buck, tell John be quiet so we can start. Good evening. Good to see everyone this evening. We've been spending some time on looking at Genesis a little differently, and hopefully you've been getting something out of that. It really is something in the last couple of years that really opened my eyes, made me look at things a lot differently. And, there's been several studies in my life that have changed my life, and they've given me comfort. I don't know how else to say it. I spent a lot of time studying the Holy Spirit. I'm better with that than I've ever been in my life, I think. I'm comfortable with that. Genesis, I'm just so many things, that I think I struggled with because I just, I don't know if I tried too hard or listened to too many different people. I'm not sure. I'm not sure what was wrong with me, but I'm in a better place, And I think Genesis is one of those things that I see that in. If you ever wrote a letter to someone, my grandmother, boy, she was a letter writer now. I mean, I remember every day. Of course, that was way before email, that way before email. And I remember every day, boy, she'd sit down, write 3 or 4 letters. She kept everybody connected, and she would write those letters out. And I still have some of those where people would respond back years and years later. But when you write somebody a letter, you want to tell them something, right? I mean, that's why you write them a letter. Tell them what's going on. Tell them how you're doing. Tell them you want them to get something out of that. Well, you think about it, that's kind of what Moses did when he wrote Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. He was writing these down. I realize they're Holy Spirit inspired, but he was writing them down to tell them something. And we have to ask, what was he telling them? What do you want them to know, right? What was important to them 7 or 8,000 years ago that, probably is not as important to us maybe, right, as it was to them. But, we started talking about this, that God's not a science teacher and the Bible's not a scientific text, right? It's just not. And that's good. It's really good, because their science isn't our science, and the science 30 years from now is not going to be our science. I was thinking when Buck was giving his talk, just a thought that came into my mind is that, God is a God of such little things, isn't he? We think, well, prayer is a little thing, we're insignificant, in the scheme of things, we're just insignificant. But isn't it funny that God created, and we know now, which we didn't know then, and we didn't really know till a few years ago, but God created with the smallest of building blocks, didn't he? DNA and atoms and molecules and stuff that's probably smaller than we might even know. God built from the little bitty, Isn't that right? If you have the little bitty, then it makes the big, right? Every big thing is made out of a whole bunch of little bitty things, and when God created, and that's hard for me to wrap my head around. If you've ever looked at DNA, we did that 23andMe thing the other day, or a while back. The kids got it for us for Christmas. It took us like 2 months to do it, but we finally did it. And, where you do this DNA, and they tell your ancestry and all this stuff. And anyway, I'm like 61% Neanderthal, by the way. Anyway, but nevertheless, but there's but that's what it says. Says you're like 61%, so your DNA is like Neanderthal. I'm like, how do you know that? but anyway, it's really, when you think about that and how complex that is, a strand of DNA, how complicated that is, it really makes you think about how complex God is, doesn't it? He's complex. There's nothing simple about God. God is complicated. He has stuff we can't even begin to understand, right? But when we talk about Genesis 1, this idea of created, and we talked about that word, and we'll look at that again, the word bara, which is to put into place or order it or put it together. And when you begin to see this in Genesis 1, that's the word we have there, is that he was putting it into order, you know. Of course, you and I, we can see that two ways, right? Created. We can see, now for us, I think created is always putting it into order for me and you. I mean, anything that we create, we're using stuff that already exists. We're just reordering it, right? I mean, isn't that what we're doing? We're not really making anything. We say, well, I made a cake. Well, you baked a cake. You baked the ingredients. You really didn't make it. I mean, the stuff was there, right? You can't make sugar and make flour. You know, only God can do those things. But we assembled it. We created it. We baked it. We did it. We created, right? I created the cake. Well, in a way, you know, that's one way to look at creation. But most of the time we look at Genesis 1, we don't look at it that way, do we? We look at it as, you know, God made it from nothing, you know, which is okay. We understand God made everything from nothing, but is that really what Genesis 1 is talking about, right? And I think as we look through it, we get that idea. In the beginning, the earth was formless and void, and darkness was over the surface of the deep. You know, in the beginning, the earth was formless and void. I mean, it was there, right? It was there. I mean, at some point, God created it, but I really don't think that's what Genesis 1's about. It's not about how God made the emptiness and the formless and the void. You know, the formless and void was there. Yeah, but that's, you can take it that way. But is that really what the story's about, you know, to them? Now, to me and you, it is. I mean, we look at it, we want to understand it. We want the science. We want, how did you make that out of nothing? But people 6,000 years ago care less, you know. What do we know about God? This is the introduction to God in the Bible. This is the introduction to God right here. This is the introduction to him. Who he is, what he does, how he moves, you know. And I think as we move through this, which I'm not going to, this isn't a verse-by-verse deal. This isn't a verse-by-verse. We got these verses, but this isn't going to be a verse-by-verse study. So, you know, we understand this in the beginning, in this ordering of things, right? Light. We understand that God made time, which blows my mind. You know, I struggle. I really struggle with that idea. You know, an eternal being that created time, an eternal being that made us non-eternal in his image, but yet we're not eternal, right? We're temporal. You know, we're only here for a while, right? We're not here forever. And God didn't create the earth to be here forever. God didn't set that in that type of motion, even though he's an eternal being. And I just think that it's interesting. God made things, God ordered things, God put things together in a way that fits you and me, right? Why do we sleep? You know, have you ever asked yourself that question? Does God sleep? Do you think God sleeps? Everybody in here would say, no, God doesn't need to sleep, right? Well, why did he make us sleep? Why did he do that to us? You know, I could get a lot more done if I didn't sleep. How about you, Brent? We get a lot done if we could just stay up 24 hours a day. You could stay on that tractor 24 hours a day, right? You never have to get off, you know? Huh? Good life. But God didn't create us that way, did he? He didn't put us together like that. You know, that's not how we're created. There's a lot of questions, you know, we probably would like to have answers to, but it's not really about answering those questions. It's about seeing that God's God, and God creates and makes things and sets things in a certain order, in a certain way, that I serve a God who has power over creation, over the universe, over nature. I serve a God who can provide for me in a way that no one else can. You right? You know, did God make the earth for us, or did he make us for the earth? Right? You know, what was last? What was created last? The earth or us? Right? God created the earth, right? He created the earth for us. Isn't that interesting how Jesus in the New Testament, he says, was the Sabbath created for man, or man for the Sabbath? Right? Which was it? Right? Was the Sabbath created for man, or was man created for the Sabbath? Sabbath was created for man, right? And when you really look at that, that's creation. you know. When I think about Genesis 1, I always think about my fish. I wasn't really successful with fish, but I think about my fish. Because if you ever buy fish, right, you really need to have a place to go with them before you buy them. Otherwise, it doesn't end well, like Flushing Freddy, right? So, if you're really into it and you're going to go buy fish, if you don't, what do you buy first, the aquarium or the fish? Well, if you're like me, you buy it all at once. But what should you buy first, the aquarium or the fish, right? You're going to buy the aquarium. And if you buy that, what are they going to tell you? They're going to say you need to put the water in there, and then you need to let it set for so many hours to get the chlorine out and treat it so that there's no chlorine. You get the temperature to regulate. And then when you put your fish in there, you got to put them in the bag and let them all get temperature adjusted, right? Isn't that kind of like what God did for us? He made this world, and then he made us just right to live in this world that he created. You ever thought about that? It's just amazing, isn't it? It's amazing how we fit, how we work, how we move, how we do. Why can't we live on the moon? Because it's not the earth. God didn't make the moon for man. He made earth for man. We go to the moon, we struggle, can't breathe, can't stand on it, right? Because he didn't make it for man, did he? He made the earth for man. This creation that he did is amazingly put together so that you and I can exist. We have the right air to breathe. We have the right gravity to walk on. We have all these things that we fit, right? And it's just amazing when you think about that. And I think when Moses was writing this to these people, that's what he wanted them to see, was that God loves you. God created this for you. God put all this together so that you could exist. And not just so you could exist, did it? So that you could thrive, didn't he? He didn't just put it together so that we could just exist in it. He put it together so that we could procreate, so that we could live, didn't he? Didn't he put beauty in the world, and he gave us the eyes to see it, and he put delicious scents in the world and terrible scents in the world, and he gave us the nose to smell it? And when you think about all those things, it makes you realize how much God cares for us. We're not accidental. Isn't that what this tells us? We're not an accident, right? He created us perfectly to fit a world that he made, right? There's no accident in that. That's really powerful to me, right? Because a lot of scientists, a lot of the world wants to think, oh, we're just accidental. We just crawled up and evolved. And the Bible doesn't say that. The Bible says we're created just as God wanted us to be. And I think when you look at that first part of Genesis that way, you begin to kind of see it. That word bara in the Hebrew, and if you really study this word, you really study this word in the Hebrew, what you will find is that every time this word's used, God's involved in it. And the deal of it is, every time it's about setting order. When the psalmist says, create in me a clean heart, O God, it's used like 63 times. Create in me a clean heart, O God. We know that we're not asking him to rip our heart out and make a new heart and stick it in us, right? We all understand that. What are we wanting him to do? Create in me a clean heart. What do you want him to do to your heart? Fix it. Make it pure, right? Set it how it's supposed to set. Make it right. We don't go, well, God's going to rip my heart out of me and put in another heart. That's not at all what it means, and we understand that. So when we see that word, like I said, that word create, we have to think, what does it mean? What does it mean in the rest of the Bible? What does it mean in the Hebrew? What does it mean in the rest of the Old Testament? And over and over and over, God's always involved in it, and over, it's this idea of putting it together, setting it in order. They weren't worried about how God made molecules and how God made DNA, because they didn't know any of those things existed, and they could care less. They didn't care. Why should they care? They didn't know. And God wasn't going to tell them. We know, to us it's a big thing. They did care less, right? What they cared about is that God gave them what they needed to live. And isn't that really what we should care about? God gave us what we need to survive. God gave us time, right? God gave us weather, and God gave us food, right? That's what we have to have in order to live on this earth, right? That's what we have to have. That was the aquarium. That was what God created. And that's what I think Moses wanted them to see. God's giving you what you need to thrive and to be the people that God wants you to be because God cares about you. Isn't that a really great thought? You know, when we have our children, right, and our children are growing up, and your children, when they look at you as a parent, if you're a good parent, I think everybody in here is a good parent. I think we can say this. If you're a good parent and your children are young and are looking towards you, what do you want your children to see in you? What do you want them to feel like when they're around you? How do you want them to feel when they're around you? Protected, huh? Safe. Provided for, don't you? Isn't that what you want for your children? You don't want your children to go hungry. You don't want your children to go thirsty. You don't want your children to be sick. And when they get sick or they get hungry or they get tired or they get thirsty, who do they go to? Go to you, right? They go to you because they know you can provide for them. You know, sometimes we forget that about God. God is our Father. You know, Buck talks about praying in all these different ways and all these different times. Why do we do that? Because when we're hungry or tired or lonely or cold or sick, who do we want to go to? Who should we want to go to? Our Father, right? Shouldn't we? We should go to our Father. God gave us this amazing world to live in. He gave us what we needed in order to survive and to thrive and to flourish. And that's what they saw in this. And sometimes I think that's what we should see in this. You know, the interesting part, which we're kind of dive back and forth a little bit here, but you know, the interesting part, because I'm kind of like running you through this, we're kind of going to back up a little bit. But the interesting part about all this creation thing is that is the seventh day. You know, where like I said, we're going to kind of go back and forth a little bit, but just trying to get your mind going here. You know, in the Hebrew, the climax of anything always comes like it does with us. Always comes at the end. It's the end of the story, right? I mean, where's the climax of the story? It's at the end, right? Isn't it funny in creation, we always get to that sixth day, God created man, and we're like, and it was very good. And that's where, man, that was good, right? And then we go, and then God rested, right? We don't even really think about that at all. We don't even think about it because it's like, well, why don't we think about it? You know, why do we miss? I mean, it's important. It's there. God rested. God rests. Does God need to rest? Does God need to sleep? Does God need a break? We just said God doesn't need to sleep. Do you think after 6 days, God was like, man, I'm give out. I need to sit down for a little while, right? None of us think that. He did do a lot. Yeah. But there ain't none of us thinks that. We don't think that. You know, we don't think, well, God needed to take a break. It was perfect. He didn't need to do anything else. He stopped. It's what it means to us, you know, because we're not them. Yeah. So when Moses wrote this, who did he really write it to? Who was he with when he wrote this? Who was the people that he was with when he wrote Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy? We always give them to Moses. What people was he with? Who was his people? Huh? The ones that came out of Egypt, right? Well, what was Egypt? How many gods did the Egyptians have? Lot. How many temples did they have? Lot. Right? We're not temple people. You know, I never really understood that till I went to Europe. I never realized how many temples there were. It is unbelievable. I can't even keep track of them. There's temples to gods I never even heard of in my entire life. I don't know how they can have that many temples. They literally stacked on top of each other. If you've ever been over there, it's literally unbelievable. We went to Delos, which is just like this island of ruins. And literally, this little place, which I'm serious, it's not as big as Henrietta, not even close. It's kind of in this little island in the middle of the Aegean Sea, and it's kind of got this mountain on it. In this little bitty place, there's 90 temples. 90. I mean, I couldn't even keep up with it. Every street you went down, it was a temple. There was a temple to Samson there. Not Samson. The strong guy, Hercules. There was a temple to Hercules there. There was a temple to Aphrodite there. There was a temple to Zeus there. There was a temple to all these gods that I never heard of in my life. These people are temple people. And when Moses came out of Egypt, was it only the Hebrews, only Israel that came out with him? No, there were a lot of Egyptians, right? A lot of Egyptians. And these people are temple people that Moses is writing this to. And something I didn't know, I found out in studying this, and something I didn't know, and I never guess I really thought about it because I'm not a temple person, is that God's rests in temples. That's where God's rest is, in temples. God resting in the Hebrew is as big as God creating. It's every bit as big. It's maybe bigger than God creating. Because when God rested, he came into the temple. He came into this. It became his. He rested. He rested here. This became his temple. Where do gods dwell? In the temple. Where do they rest? In the temple. When God created the earth, what Moses was telling all these people that came out of Egypt and all these temple people is this is God's temple. This whole thing is God's. He belongs here. He rests here. He dwells here. You're not by yourself. This is where God dwells. If you were in their world, you wanted to go see a God, where'd you go? Temple. You want to go make a sacrifice, where'd you go? Temple. Where do gods rest? Temple. Gods weren't in the temples all the time. If you study that Mesopotamian or Egyptian or Roman or Egyptian, gods weren't in the temples all the time. Gods were in different temples. God rested in different temples. And so when God says that to them, you and I think, oh, well, God rested. God did all this. He was done. He rested. But God, he didn't write this to us. And to them it meant God done this creation. God made all this. God created all this. And God stepped into his temple. God stepped into this. It's the temple text. And if you look at the Psalms, it says, let us go into his dwelling place and worship at his footstool. Arise, O Lord, to your resting place, where you rest. You see? Where God rests, where he is, where he dwells. The Lord has chosen Zion. He has desired for his habitation. This is my resting place, he said. What's Zion in the Old Testament? What's Zion? Huh? City of God. Zion's always the city of God. In the New Testament, we understand that's heaven now. We understand that. But in the Old Testament, it was the city of God. It's where God rested. Where was the temple at? In Jesus' time, where was the temple? It's in Jerusalem. Where was Zion? What was Zion? It was the temple. It was Jerusalem. Where God was. That was the city of God. That's where God rested. That's where God dwelt. That was his habitation. And so God became, and if you were an Israelite, if you were a Hebrew, God was in the Holy of Holies, right? That's where God was. Was he there all the time? No. But when the high priest went in there in the Day of Atonement to meet God, where was God? He was in the temple. He was in the resting place. He was in the Holy of Holies. That's where he was. That was where he dwelt. That was his habitation. So to them, to say God rested means God was here. This was his temple. God was in this place. God didn't leave us. God just didn't create us and step back. God created us and dwelt with us. Dwells with us. Isn't it interesting in Exodus 3 when God sees Moses and God says, who do I say sent me? And God said, what did he say? Tell them the what? Sent you. The I am. Right? I am here. I am here. Right? I am now. I am present. I am not the God of yesterday or the God of tomorrow, but the God of now. I am the God of Jacob. Right? I am the God of Abraham, and I am the God of you. You see, that this is where God is. And if you really look at Genesis, and you really start to pull Genesis apart, isn't it interesting that God creates man, and he puts him in there, and then when we get to Genesis 3, which is not there yet, but when we get Genesis, it says God came. What did he come to do when he found out they'd sinned? What was he going to do? Going to walk in the garden, come to walk with them in the cool of the day, right? That God didn't step back, God didn't abandon them, God wanted to be with them, right? Do you know what the word paradise in the Bible, do you know what that word means, paradise? In the New Testament, we talk about paradise. You know what that word means? You know what paradise of God is? It's the garden. Word means garden. When it says, today you will dwell with me in the garden. You see? Why is that important? What's in the garden? The tree of what? Tree of life. You see? Today you will be with me in the garden of God. Fascinating, isn't it? It's amazing how it all comes together. Where I'm kind of getting ahead of it, but I just can't help it. I just kind of got to skip around a little bit. In Revelation, when John gets his vision into heaven, what's in heaven? What's in heaven? The tree of what? Tree of life. Right? And what did he tell the thief? Today you will be with me in the garden. And when John looks into heaven, what's there? The tree of life. Where's the tree of life? In the garden of God. You see? It's really just kind of gives you chills, or it does me, when I really start to see how all this so fits together. Because he kicked us out, right? He kicked us out. And in the end, we're going to go back. You see? He's going to let us back in. Right? It says, for we have believed enter that rest, just as he has said in Hebrews, just as I swore my wrath, they shall not enter my rest. My rest. God's rest. They won't enter it. Okay? What's God's rest? What's his rest? Heaven. Right? It says, although his works were finished from the foundation of the world, for he has said somewhere concerning the seventh day, and God rested on the seventh day from all his works, and again in this passage, they shall not enter my rest. Therefore, since it remains for some to enter it, and those who formerly had good news preached to them failed to enter because of disobedience, he again fixes a certain day today, saying, though David, after so long a time, just as he had been said before, today, if you hear his voice, do not harden your hearts, for if Joshua had given them rest, they would not have spoken of another day after that. You see, in Hebrews, the Hebrew writer is dealing with this double idea, this parallel universe, if you want to look at it that way. He's trying to show these people that he's addressed to, these Hebrews, he's trying to show them. He says, listen, there's two journeys and two rests. Right? One journey was to the promised land, over the Jordan River, into the rest that God gave us, right? Into the rest of God. In other words, we're going to go over into the promised land. And then the Hebrew writer is saying, but in a parallel of that, you and I are traveling through this world, traveling in the wilderness. Eventually, we're going to cross over the Jordan, which to us is death. And we're going to enter into what? Enter into the rest of God, where God is. When Joshua and the Hebrews, when they came across that Jordan River, right? And they were entering into the promised land, they had that Ark of the Covenant with them. You remember that? And they had that tabernacle, that tent of dwelling, didn't they? And when they got over into that promised land, they set that tabernacle up, and they set that tent up, and they set that Holy of Holies up, and they put that Ark of the Covenant in there. And why did they do that? Because they wanted to know where God was. God's dwelling here. God's resting here. God's gave us this land. And the Hebrew writer's saying, but, if that had been the rest, then why would they be looking for another one? You see, be diligent to enter that rest, that no one will fall through following the same example of disobedience. Why did the Israelites not cross over and enter the rest of God? Because they were disobedient. They didn't cross over the Jordan. He's saying, don't be disobedient. Cross over into that rest, eternal rest. But when I see that word rest, that always bothers me in the Bible, because I don't know that I want to rest. I'm not a rester, right? Just don't know that I want to do that, you know? I mean, when I always looked at the Bible as a kid, I always thought, man, it'd be great. But then I thought, you know what? That's eternity's a long time, isn't it? Eternity's a long time. I mean, long time. I mean, it isn't time, right? You got to take that word out of it. Eternity is eternity. Eternity has nothing to do with time. Time doesn't exist in eternity, right? And I mean, I'm sure it's going to be good to sing God's praises and be before the throne and do all those things, but eternity is a long time, right? And I want something to do. How about you? And when I always looked at that rest, I thought, we're just going to go to heaven, we're going to rest. You know, sometimes that sounds pretty good, right? But how would it be after a while, right? I mean, I don't know how we're going to be in heaven. I don't even understand heaven, right? I'm just looking at it from Rex's view. You know what I'm saying? When God put him in the Garden of Eden, what did he say to him? Did he say, just rest and take it easy? I'm going to take care of you here. What did he tell him? Tend the garden, care for it, name these animals, right? Tend and keep it. God knew that he didn't create them to rest. God doesn't rest. Do you think it would be, do you think it even makes sense to think that this is the only world that God's ever created or the only galaxy that God's ever created? Do you think that even, would that make sense? Does anybody make one cake? Just want to know that. You know, I'm going to make a cake. Oh, that's good. I'm done. I'm never making another one of those. Right? We don't do that. We're not built like that, right? You're going to make a better one, right? You're going to make another one, a different kind, different flavor, right? Because that's not how we work. There's no artist on earth that ever said, I'm going to make one painting and that's it. I'm done. That's my painting. I'm done. I'm never going to do that again, right? No, that's not us. Aren't we in God's image? You know, do you think that God quit? Do you think God made this, made earth, made us and quit? Well, I've got it right. I'm done. Right? I think that's ludicrous, you know? I don't think that makes any sense. And so every time when I was a kid, I'd read this idea of rest, and I thought, you can only rest so long. I mean, at some point, you got to do something. I want to do something when I get to heaven. You know, I think God has plans for us. I think God's got a garden for us to tend and keep or something. You know, I do. I believe that. I don't think God's just going to say, oh, well, you've made it. You can rest for eternity now. I don't believe that. I think God is a creator. God's a mover. God's a shaker. God's somebody that's always doing something. And God didn't create us on this earth and give us a way to get to be with him for eternity so that we can just lay back on our lazy boy recliner. I don't believe that. And that's what I always read when I read these passages until I finally really understood what he was talking about. It's talking about being where God is, right? Being where God is, being in his presence, being in his company. And if you really look at the garden, if you really look at Genesis and you really think about that garden, what God did, God created a job. Did you ever look at it that way? God created a job for man. You know, God didn't just create a world for us to live in. God created a purpose for us. Because I think we have to have that. Don't you? You know, there's this show, probably shouldn't even bring this up, but there's this show, and it's called The Good Place. And I don't know that it's the best show or the worst show, but it's kind of about these people that go to the good place, you know, which is heaven, supposedly, kind of that idea, right? And so they go to this good place, but they find out the good place is really the bad place. And they're trying to torture them by making the good place bad. And I'm blowing this for you. I told you to watch the show. And so anyway, it goes through all this thing about the bad place and the good place and how they're like battling this out, you know, and they have to, anyway, it's a pretty long series. But at the end of the thing, they finally wind up in the good place, the real good place. And when they get up there, everybody's just zombied out. You know, nobody's happy. Nobody's, because everybody's like, because you can do anything there. You can do anything you want to do. But these people have been here for like 4,000 years, you know, and they're like, we've done literally everything that we could ever want to do. I mean, how much can you do? You know, how much of a good thing can you do before at some point in the scope of eternity, you say, well, I don't want to do that anymore. I mean, I can't hardly make it a month doing something, right? I'm ready to try something new. How about you? And so it's kind of this real profound thought at the end because they go there and everybody's miserable. And they say, well, what are you going to do? How are you going to make people not be miserable? And so they said, well, the only way you can do that is to give them an end. And so they make this door, which you never find out where this goes, but like this door into oblivion. And they tell people, well, when you're done doing all the things that you ever wanted to do and enjoying everything you ever wanted to enjoy and all this, then you can like step through this door. And we really don't know what happens after that. But it really made me think, you know? I mean, it's kind of a stupid show. But it really made me think, what is eternity going to be like? You know? What makes things, I know I'm out of time, but I just want to pose a question. What makes things so special to us here? Huh? God, but more important than that, what makes a baby precious and spending time with your family? What makes that special? Knowing that there's an end. I mean, isn't that right? Knowing that I only have so much time. Am I right? Isn't that what makes life precious? Is the very idea that I only have so much. Do you ever play those games in your head? Maybe I'm the only person that does that. I used to really love to canoe. And I don't like to do that anymore. Well, I probably would, but it's just way too much work. But I used to really love to canoe. And I'd be in that canoe, and I was like 20-something years old, and I thought, you know, if I could canoe 3 times a year until I'm 60 years old, I'd only get to canoe this many rivers. And it made me sad because I realized that could only do that much. Right? You know, life is precious, isn't it? Love is precious because we know it's not going to last. We know we can't hold on to it forever. But what it's going to be like when we go to some place where there's forever. Have you ever really thought about this? What's it going to be like when you go someplace that there is forever? And I'm not trying to, I just want you to think. Because I think my view of heaven is not what it was 3 or 4 years ago. It's just not. It's just not. Because I think eternity, God's got something up his sleeve. I don't know what it is. But God's got something up his sleeve. It's more than you can imagine. Right. Yeah, it's more than we can imagine. Because God created us just like he created them for a purpose. He created us for a purpose. And I believe if God created us for a purpose, it wasn't just a purpose here. It was for a purpose there. And that makes me really get excited. You know? Thanks for your time.